Announces a new $1.4 trillion stimulus package. It prepares for a possible trade war with Donald Trump. Shares in the owner of British Airways surge as it reports a 15% rise in operating profits. Plus, the UK's labour market shows more sign of cooling, with pay growth slowing to its lowest rate since February 2021. Very good morning. Welcome to Business Live with me, Darren McCaffrey, on this Friday. Before we get into the business news, let's just dip in, if we can, to this press conference that's taking place in Amsterdam, following effectively the arrest of dozens of people last night, with anti-Semitic rioters actively seeking out Israeli supporters following a football match in Amsterdam. The mayor of Amsterdam and the chief of police currently holding that press conference. It is in Dutch, but we are keeping it across, and we'll bring you any news lines that do emerge. After that violence, 62 people arrested after disorder in the Netherlands. 5 people were taken to hospital. As I say, that news conference is underway. We'll keep across it for any news lines and bring you those news lines as they emerge over the next half an hour or so. But let's return to business news now, and Beijing has announced a new $1.4 trillion stimulus package to help kickstart its faltering economy. The plans will help local governments with debt repayment, with China's finance minister suggesting that further stimulus measures may well be on the way. It comes as China is bracing for the threat of big trade tariffs from the president-elect Donald Trump when he moves into the White House. Let's speak to our Beijing and Asia correspondent, Nicole Johnson, who joins us now from the Chinese capital. First of all, this is not the first stimulus package we've seen in recent months from China. Talk us through the details of the one that's been announced overnight.
That's right. The timing of this is really interesting, isn't it? That China's top legislative council decided to have this meeting for 5 days to come up with a stimulus package in the same week as the US election, which makes you think that China was waiting to see who the winner of that election would be. Well, we know that it is President-elect Trump, and that is going to have a big impact on the economy here if these tariffs go ahead. So as for the stimulus package, the most significant part of it is some $840 billion that's been earmarked to help these local governments. Because that's one of the big issues here. These local governments are drowning in debt, some $2 trillion worth of hidden debt, so debt that's off the books. Now, the government here knows that that is a massive problem. There had been some sort of tinkering around the edges to try and deal with it, but this is a significant development to try and handle that problem. All of this, of course, stems back to the real estate issue. As the real estate sector here, various parts of it started to decline and collapse. Then those local governments weren't receiving their taxes that they would ordinarily get, land sales, and so they started to accumulate this debt. I think it's still too early to tell what kind of impact this will have. This will be introduced over the next 3 years, but it is the latest in a series of stimulus packages in this country. The last big one was in September. There's been a few since there. They've been a bit of a letdown. The market hasn't been impressed. So we'll probably have to wait until Monday when the markets reopen and analysts start to digest this news, because it's really only come out in the last couple of hours, to see how China will deal with this going forward.
And Nicole, there's been a lot of focus on what an incoming President Trump may well do when he gets into the White House in January. And one of those, of course, is a potential trade war, massive tariffs, particularly on China. What's the view in Beijing, and what potentially could their response be?
Well, certainly from Beijing's perspective, the last thing that they want is a trade war. They've already had one iteration of that the last time that Trump was in power. So it is somewhat baked in. They would have been expecting that some kind of trade war is coming. He'd been talking about these 60% tariffs for months now, threatening China, not only China, of course, a whole raft of countries. He's also said 10 to 20% tariffs for the rest of the world. So China will be deeply concerned, and some of the analysis that's coming out is saying that if a 60% tariff was to happen on all goods from China into the United States, it would cut this country's GDP growth by 2.5%, which is half. Now, the Chinese government had been expecting or hoping for around 5% growth this year, so 2.5% going forward would be a massive blow to the economy here. What can China do? Well, they may well do what they did the first time around, which is introduce taxes on agricultural exports from the United States coming into China. That is something that would hit the US. But another interesting leverage tool that they could use, another lever they could pull, so to speak, is the issue of critical minerals, and that's something we've been reporting about here. China has been introducing export controls on these sort of rare earth materials, things like antimony, germanium, gallium. You may not have heard of them, but they are vitally important to the clean energy transition because they're used in all sorts of things from batteries to solar panels. So China knows that it has leverage there, because 90% of all of the processing of the world's critical minerals is done in this country.
And just very finally, Nicole, outside of China, but the rest of Asia, there could well be an impact there. What about the rest of Asia and their view on an incoming President Trump?
Well, as I said, they are just as concerned as China is. While President-elect Trump hadn't been talking about 60% tariffs for the rest of the world, he had mentioned 10 to 20% tariffs. And there are also a lot of countries in Southeast Asia that take exports from China, and then from there, they are sent to the United States. So the US is well aware of that, countries like Vietnam, for example. And that is another area that they could try and cut back on, increasing tariffs. So across the entire region, of course, there's a great deal of concern about what is going to happen next. But of course, it's too early to tell. There is also another school of thought, so to speak, which is that President-elect Trump, as we know, he likes to do deals. He prefers bilateral action. He prefers to make friendships with certain world leaders. So there is a sense in Asia as well that perhaps they can work around that by certain countries' leaders having a good relationship with President-elect Trump. And that is something that China's President Xi Jinping may already be trying to do. He has spoken to Trump on the phone. So I'm sure across the region there are all sorts of conversations underway about how various governments are going to deal with what could turn out to be a global trade war.
Indeed. Nicole, great stuff. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Nicole Johnson there in Beijing. Let's take you back to Amsterdam. As I say, we're keeping across that press conference that's taking place by the Mayor of Amsterdam and indeed the Chief of Police following the violence that we saw last night. Dozens of people arrested, 62 people, in fact, arrested, 5 people taken to hospital. The Mayor saying that essentially she's furious by what happened last night, also saying that there will be an independent investigation into what happened, and also making a comparison to how last night's events reminded her of pogroms. That is what the Mayor of Amsterdam is saying. This was obviously attacks on Israeli football fans who were in the capital watching their team play Ajax. But we know that, according to the authorities, anti-Semitic rioters actively sought out Israeli supporters to attack. As I said, it led to 5 people ending up in hospital. and the arrests of dozens of people. Pretty shocking scenes on the streets of Amsterdam. The authorities, as I say, giving this press conference. It's in Dutch at the moment. We are expecting potentially at some stage that it will change to English. But as you see, the Mayor of Amsterdam saying that she is furious about the violence last night. We'll keep across that, any more lines, and we'll bring you up to date here on Sky News. But let's bring you up to date with the rest of today's business stories, if we can. And the UK's labour market shows more sign of cooling, with pay growth slowing to its lowest rate since February 2021. According to KPMG and the Employment and Recruitment Federation, permanent wage growth dropped in October. Demand for staff fell for the 12th month in a row, while permanent job replacements slumped at the fastest pace since March. The owner of British Airways has reported profits of £1.7 billion in the 3 months to the end of September. That's up almost 15% on a year ago. International Airlines Group, which is also the parent company of Aer Lingus and Iberia Airlines, says that fuel was cheaper and aircraft are becoming more efficient. It also puts down the results to strategy and transformation and strong demand. Shares in the house builder Vistry fell by 13% in early trading this morning after it issued its second full-year profit warning in a month. The Kent-based company, which is the UK's biggest home builder by annual output, said it expects to adjust profit before tax for the year ending to December 31st this year of around £300 million, lower than the £350 million it expected last month. It comes as the sector has seen some signs of recovery in recent months following 2 interest rate cuts and supportive policy measures in last month's budgets. The UK's competition watchdog, that's the Competition and Markets Authority, says that baby formula products need a shake-up to help parents struggling to afford it. But it stops short of recommending a price cap. An interim report found that some vulnerable families may opt for more expensive options without clear information, linking higher costs to better quality for their children. And there's more on that story and indeed the rest of today's business news on our Money blog. Just scan the QR code on your screen now for that. Now, since Rachel Reeves delivered Labour's first budget in 14 years last week, Labour's plan for growth has been hotly debated. Now, experts, though, are warning that an absence of attention to foreign aid spending threatens to reduce business opportunities in developing countries for British investors as a more protectionist president takes over at the White House. So what does it mean for foreign investment in markets like Africa and elsewhere? Let's speak to Ryan Henson. He's Chief Executive of the Coalition for Global Prosperity, who's just published this analysis. Very good morning to you, Ryan. Many people see foreign aid as taking money out of Britain, if you like, to help countries, but they don't see it as a two-way process. Is that what you're getting here, that foreign aid actually can be beneficial beyond just helping people out?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, at the Coalition and in the report that you kindly referenced there, Darren, we make the point that the UK's spending overseas isn't just the right thing to do morally, although of course it is, but it benefits the UK significantly as well. And that can be seen through a manner of different sort of pathways, if you like. The first is when it comes to tackling irregular migration. I was in Uganda earlier this year meeting with refugees who'd fled the conflict in South Sudan, who had said that if it were not for the support provided in Uganda, they would be on their way to Europe. They're absolutely desperate. They would have had no other choice. I think that's a good example. But equally, if the UK wants to create and help support economies in Africa so that we're creating or supporting other countries to build trading relationships, then it's absolutely in our interest to invest in international development. And by the way, it should be a partnership. It should be a relationship with those countries, not just the UK imposing what it wants to do. But it's absolutely in our interest, and I think it's something that's frequently overlooked.
So, but you're essentially saying that foreign aid buys you access, if you like. Is that the argument? If it is to be this kind of partnership, if you like, but you're still spending money, the UK spending money, to gain access to markets?
I think that's one way of looking at it. I mean, and at the Coalition, certainly, we take the view that it's worth doing this because it's the right thing to do. The UK is not without means. Despite our domestic challenges, we have the world's 6th largest economy. We're a member of the UN Security Council. If we can't support people who are desperately in need, then frankly, who can? So the UK should do its bit. But absolutely, I think we have to acknowledge that, particularly given the geopolitical challenges, and you referenced obviously the election of President Trump just a couple of days ago, we have to acknowledge that it's in the UK's interest to be in countries and helping to ensure that our economy is a match for all of those other countries that are also seeking these relationships. Russia, China are also in Africa. And if the UK pulls out, they will fill that void. And I think policymakers have to ask themselves, is that something that we want? Is that good for what the UK is trying to achieve in its foreign policy? And is it good for UK businesses and the economy? I would argue that it's not.
So are you essentially saying that we're potentially moving into a more isolationist world, in the sense that President Trump has made it clear that he's going to put America first? We know that in Europe it is the right that is on the rise, in the sense that, again, they're likely to be a bit more insular. Are you fearful that the West is going to lose its influence in places like sub-Saharan Africa?
Well, I think anyone who's listened to President-elect Trump on the campaign trail is right to be concerned. I mean, he, as you say, he's been very clear that he's pursuing tariffs, the protectionism that he started in 2016, which, by the way, was continued to some extent under the Biden administration, is set to continue. But I think at the same time, there is enough hope, if you like, for policymakers and advocates like me to move into. We know that it's not in the interest of the US or President Trump for Russia to succeed in their war against Ukraine. It's not in the interest of the American people for their economy to take a hit, for inflation to remain high. I mean, there's many reasons for that, but one of the main consequences of the war in Ukraine is high inflation. So I think if those messages can be imparted, and I'm sure that our government in the UK will be landing those messages as best they can, then I think we can make the argument that actually isolationism doesn't benefit the American people, certainly doesn't benefit the people of Europe, that if we work together to solve the problems without passports, irregular migration caused in part by
and we seem
climate change, then it's in everyone's interest.
OK, Ryan, you broke up a little bit there. Fascinating discussion. I'd love to carry on about maybe that foreign aid needs to be rebranded if it's to get greater public consent, but we'll leave that for another day. That's Ryan Henson there from the Coalition for Global Prosperity. Thank you very much indeed. Just to bring you a line from that press conference in Amsterdam, we reported that 5 people have been taken to hospital. The Amsterdam chief prosecutor is now saying that the 5 injured supporters have left hospital this morning. So those 5 Israeli football fans who had been injured in Amsterdam overnight have now left hospital. You're watching Sky News, you're watching Business Live. We're going to be looking at the markets in just a couple of minutes. As you can see, the FTSE down nearly 1%. We'll be explaining why after this quick break.
There's always more to the news than a headline. We want to discover, to delve a little deeper, to find out what's really going on. Explanation, analysis, the people at the heart of every story. I'm Neil Patterson, and this is the Sky News Daily Podcast. Alex Crawford joining us now from Ukraine.
Their personal possessions are all scattered around the place.
Our economics and data editor, Ed Conway, try and make sense of the big numbers for us.
Things can change incredibly quickly, and that's what they have done.
So, by the end, we'll hopefully all understand what's going on in the world just that little better. Available wherever you get your podcasts.
I saw police being forceful, pushing young men and women to the ground as they made almost 100 arrests. Will the cold affect your voters?
Well, we have a lot of tremendous support.
Free wherever you get your news.
The people here know that worse storms may well be on their way.
I'm Martha Kellner and I'm Sky's US correspondent based here in Los Angeles.
Trust
in politics is at an all-time low. What's going wrong and can we fix it? It's from Liz. She wants to know, why is there still no sign of the Labour Party electing a woman as leader?
It's sort of embarrassing. You know, it takes a very strong man to be leader, but it takes an even stronger man to support a woman for leader.
If you want to be mean to politicians, like, crack on. The activists that go out and make elections happen, I kind of feel like just don't be horrible to them. Be polite to them in the same way that they're polite to you.
Keir Starmer has got us into government with a big majority. He was completely clear before the election that he wasn't going to be able to do the two-child benefit policy, but I wouldn't be surprised if it isn't an early thing that comes along.
I went up to Gordon Brown and said, hello? No, yes, what is it? I said, found all these Tory candidates breaking land. Let me see it. This is brilliant.
I'm Katie Spencer and I'm Sky News' arts and entertainment correspondent. As a team, we've interviewed some of the biggest stars in the world, the likes of Tom Cruise, Brad Pitt, Sir Elton John. We try to give you an honest sense of how these people really are.
Very welcome back to Sky News. Let's dip back into that press conference that's taking place in Amsterdam this morning following those clashes in which 5 people were injured, had been taken to hospital, Israeli football fans, dozens of people arrested in what has been viewed and branded as anti-Semitic attacks in Amsterdam following a football game. We've been hearing from the mayor of Amsterdam, who says that she is furious by what happens. We're also hearing from the police chief that there are no signs of hostage-taking or missing people, that there will be an independent investigation. But also very clear that Israeli fans were willfully attacked, that they were deliberately targeted, if you like, in this violence last night. As I say, a furious mayor, an independent investigation, and 5 people who had been taken to hospital. It's just been revealed that they have now subsequently left hospital. But as I say, dozens of people arrested at that press conference continuing in Amsterdam, and we'll keep across more of that as it emerges. Now, let's take you through the markets this morning, and this is how Asia has finished up after a mixed picture with the Federal Reserve cut to interest rates again to ease pressure on the US economy. Bit of a mixed bag there. Pretty similar picture here in Europe on the back of mixed earnings with heavyweight luxury brands among the biggest fallers. The FTSE here opened down 1%, the big fall of history, as we were talking about earlier on. The house builder dropping 14% after it again cut profit guidance. In a positive note, though, IAG, of course, the owners of British Airways, they're up nearly 7% today after a pretty big rise in their profits and the plans to buy back some shares. Let's have a look at the currencies, and sterling is down a little against the dollar this morning, but still above $1.30, up against the euro. And if we look at the price of oil, we can see that Brent crude is, essentially $75 a barrel. Right, let's bring in Nathan Sweeney. He's Chief Investment Officer at Marlborough Investment Management and joins us. Very good morning to you, Nathan. Let's talk, because we haven't actually, about the rate cut that we saw in the Fed yesterday. How is that feeding into what the markets are doing in Asia and Europe today?
Yeah, so I think it's been quite a busy week, obviously, in markets this week, and it's something that's kind of flown under the radar. So we've had that cut in interest rates as expected, so 25 basis points. And ultimately, what we're seeing here is a bit of caution from the Fed in terms of what to expect next. So there's some concerns about inflation. So some of the policies coming out from the new administration in the US may be seen as inflationary. So just a little bit of a cautious tone on what to expect going forward.
Let's talk, if we can, about luxury goods, because they've been taking a hammering over the last couple of weeks, and today's no different.
Yeah, so if we look at luxury goods, we actually had a company reporting, so Richemont. So most people may not have heard of this company, but you've probably heard of Cartier, or you've probably heard of IWC. So this is luxury watches. So what we've seen in the luxury goods market is that people are stepping back. And a lot of this is actually linked to China. Because if we look at the consumer in China, ultimately that consumer is feeling less well off at this moment in time because property prices have fallen substantially. And a huge amount of people's wealth is tied to property in China. So about 63% of their wealth. And if you look at property prices, they're down 25%. So if you're a consumer, you're probably not feeling that confident. And if you're not feeling that confident, then you're not willing to spend on luxury goods. So what we're seeing from Richemont is that about 18% decline in sales in Asia, and that's specifically linked to watches, or lower watch sales coming through there.
And Nathan, we also should talk about British Airways and its group. I read the other day that they're cutting back on lunch and business class to save some money, and yet they're doing pretty well when it comes to profit.
Yes, they're actually doing really well. So this is one of the surprise stories of this morning. So ultimately, we have seen a 7% increase in the share price there. And ultimately, they have a good hold on the transatlantic market. So if you don't know who IAG are, ultimately, they're the company behind British Airways, the company behind Iberia, and also Aer Lingus. And they've reported good earnings. So we're seeing earnings of about 1.7 billion. That's in sterling terms, so that's a big, big number. And what they're saying is that there's no let up in demand for transatlantic travel. And interestingly, if you look at the plane, obviously the seats at the front of the plane are more expensive. And they're saying, actually, we're seeing continued demand. So what they're saying there is that people are willing to spend up on business travel. And they expect to see a 6% increase on the number of people on seats by the end of the year as well. So a good set of results all in all.
Indeed, even if the experience for some passengers might not be as good as it once was. Nathan, really appreciate your time this morning. That's Nathan Sweeney there from Marlborough Investment Management. Thank you. Let's just bring you some more news that's emerging from that press conference. The city's acting police chief in Amsterdam talking about how fans were willfully attacked. We know that 5 people were hospitalised. They have now been released. 62 people arrested. There will be a protest ban in the Netherlands this weekend. But the authorities describing this as a systematic anti-Semitic violence in which Israeli fans were deliberately targeted in hit-and-run attacks. All that and much more coming up with Wilf in just a couple of minutes from Amsterdam. Stay tuned for that.